James adjusted the shoulder strap of his heavy camera bag, casting a long look at the horizon where the gray outlines of Pripyat's decaying buildings loomed like skeletal fingers reaching toward the overcast sky. Behind him, Mark, Sarah, and David huddled together, their breaths fogging in the chilly autumn air. The drive had been silent, with each of them absorbed in their own thoughts, but now that they stood at the edge of the infamous exclusion zone, an unspoken tension hummed between them. This was no ordinary expedition. Pripyat had haunted their imaginations for years. The place was a forbidden legend among urban explorers, a desolate ghost town frozen in time by the Chernobyl disaster. Only the bravest, or perhaps the most reckless, ventured here. For James, the leader of the group, Pripyat represented the ultimate challenge. He'd explored countless abandoned sites, but this was different. It wasn't just another decaying building. It was an entire city, left to rot beneath a radioactive sky. The sound of distant crows echoed through the silence, a sharp reminder of the unnatural quiet that blanketed Pripyat. No children's laughter, no chatter of voices, just the wind whispering through broken windows and the soft rustle of overgrown weeds reclaiming cracked asphalt. "Are we really doing this?" Sarah's voice wavered, a faint smile masking her apprehension. She was the thrill seeker of the group, always chasing that next rush, but even she seemed uneasy as she stared into the city's shadowed streets. "Yeah," James replied, his voice steady. "We've come this far. There's no turning back now." Mark, the quiet one, adjusted his camera. "Think of the photos," he muttered, a spark of excitement flickering in his eyes. But James noticed how his hands shook slightly as he lifted the lens. The emptiness surrounding them seemed to press in, stifling the usual thrill of discovery. They moved as a group, crossing into the city with measured steps. Every sound seemed magnified, the crunch of gravel beneath their feet, the distant squeak of a rusted swing swaying in the breeze, the eerie echo of their own breaths. Each of them knew the radiation levels were manageable for a few hours, but the Geiger counter James carried still emitted a faint, sporadic crackle that served as a grim reminder of where they were. As they entered the city, the buildings loomed taller, casting elongated shadows that shifted with each step. Pripyat's ruins were everywhere, a silent testament to lives interrupted, dreams abandoned. Mark snapped photo after photo, capturing the skeletal remains of an amusement park where a giant Ferris wheel stood frozen against the pale sky. Sarah's eyes darted from shadow to shadow, her earlier bravado fading as they delved deeper into the dead city. David, who had always been fascinated by the disaster, trailed behind, pausing to read the remnants of faded Soviet propaganda posters plastered on crumbling walls. "It's like they just vanished," he murmured, tracing a finger over the worn lettering. The posters urged citizens to believe in a brighter tomorrow, but here, in the heart of the exclusion zone, those words rang hollow, mocking the decaying world around them. "Let's stick together," James instructed, his voice firm. "No wandering off." He glanced over his shoulder, catching the others' eyes, and they nodded in silent agreement. None of them wanted to get separated, not here. As they ventured deeper, a strange feeling crept over James. He couldn't shake the sensation that they were being watched. It was absurd, he told himself. Pripyat was deserted, abandoned for decades. But still, the feeling gnawed at him, a low hum of anxiety that he couldn't ignore. Then, just as they rounded a corner near the school building, Mark froze. "Guys," he whispered, pointing toward a fogged window. The others followed his gaze. Through the smeared glass, they saw a figure standing still, just beyond the frame. It was a man, or something that looked like a man, dressed in a tattered military uniform and an old, battered gas mask. The glass eyes of the mask were blank, staring straight at them with an unsettling stillness. For a moment, no one moved. They stood frozen, hearts pounding, the silence stretching on like an eternity. Who is that?" Sarah stammered, her voice barely a whisper. But before anyone could answer, the figure was gone. A flicker of motion, and he vanished, swallowed by the shadows of the ruined building. For a few heartbeats, they remained rooted to the spot, barely breathing. The man in the gas mask, had they really seen him? Or had their minds, already on edge, conjured an illusion from the shadows? It had to be another explorer, right? David suggested, though his voice wavered. His eyes scanned the street around them, as if expecting the man to reappear at any moment. James shook his head, trying to dispel the growing dread that knotted his stomach. I don't know. It didn't feel right. They moved on, more cautiously now, with every creak of decayed wood or distant clang echoing through the hollow city, twisting their nerves. Every step took them deeper into Pripyat's labyrinth, where the past clung to the walls like an invisible presence, haunting and unrelenting. The man in the gas mask lingered in their minds, a silent specter stalking their thoughts. They finally reached the hospital, an imposing building half devoured by ivy and rot. The entrance yawned open, a cavernous mouth leading into darkness. James hesitated, but they had come too far to turn back now. Let's check it out, he said, forcing confidence into his voice. Inside, the air was heavy, stale, filled with the scent of mildew and decay. They picked their way through shattered glass and broken furniture, stepping over scattered medical equipment and rusted beds. Mark, ever the photographer, raised his camera, the flash illuminating the dim hallways in brief, ghostly bursts. But as they moved through the corridors, an unsettling sound began to echo in the distance. A soft, metallic scraping, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. The sound was faint at first, barely perceptible, but it grew louder with each step they took. James's pulse quickened. He glanced at the others, their faces pale and tense, eyes darting toward the source of the sound. Then they saw him again, the man in the gas mask, standing at the end of the hallway, still and silent, his glassy eyes fixed on them. And then he started to move. With an unnatural, jerking motion, he began to walk toward them, his steps slow but unyielding, each one echoing through the empty hospital. Run! Sarah's voice cut through the silence, a raw edge of panic breaking her usual calm. They turned and bolted down the corridor, their footsteps slamming against the cracked tiles, the distant scraping sound following close behind. They could hear his heavy breathing now, filtered through the gas mask, a grotesque, rasping sound that seemed to fill the entire hallway. They rounded a corner, ducking into a nearby storage room, slamming the door shut. They leaned against it, breathing heavily, hearts racing as they pressed their ears to the cold, metal surface. Outside, the sound of footsteps slowed, then stopped. A silence settled over them, thick and oppressive, but it was shattered by a faint, rhythmic shuffling just beyond the door. Then came a sickening, metallic scrape, closer this time, as if the man was right outside. And then Mark's scream tore through the silence. They wrenched the door open, but it was too late. Mark's flashlight lay on the floor, its beam casting a weak, flickering light down the corridor. He was gone, dragged away into the shadows by the silent figure in the gas mask. James, Sarah, and David stood in stunned silence, staring down the shadowed corridor where Mark had been just moments before. The flashlight flickered once more, casting long, eerie shadows that twisted and danced over the peeling paint and cracked tiles. An overwhelming wave of panic rose in James's chest, but he forced himself to stay calm, if only for the others. He took him, Sarah whispered, her voice quivering as she clutched David's arm. Her wide eyes were fixed on the darkness ahead, as though expecting the man to emerge at any moment, dragging Mark's lifeless body with him. We have to go, James said, trying to keep his voice steady, though the tremor betrayed his own fear. There's no saving him, not now. David opened his mouth to argue, his face twisted with shock and disbelief, but he closed it again, realizing the grim truth. Whatever had taken Mark was still out there, and it was coming for them next. They took off down a side corridor, weaving through the darkened maze of hospital rooms, the sounds of their frantic footsteps echoing in the hollow silence. Outside, the sky had turned a deep shade of gray, casting a dim, ghostly light through the broken windows. Shadows clung to every corner, turning the decaying building into a labyrinth of fear and uncertainty. But the man in the gas mask was relentless. Every so often, they'd hear his footsteps behind them, that slow, deliberate rhythm growing louder, echoing closer. And then, nothing. He would vanish again, slipping into the shadows as if he were part of the building itself. They finally stumbled out of the hospital, gasping for air as they spilled into the open street. The familiar landmarks, the Ferris wheel, the rows of lifeless apartment buildings, seemed twisted, distorted in the dim light. Pripyat was no longer just an abandoned city. It was a hunting ground, and they were the prey. "We have to split up," James said, his voice hoarse. "If we stay together, he'll find us. We need to confuse him, make him think we've gone in different directions." Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "No, James. We have to stay together. If we split up, he'll pick us off one by one." James's jaw tightened, but he knew she was right. Yet every instinct screamed that they needed to move fast, to be unpredictable if they had any hope of survival. In the end, they had little choice but to keep running. They fled deeper into Pripyat, weaving between buildings, each of them barely managing to keep up with the others. The sounds of the man's heavy footsteps and gasping breaths seemed to fade, replaced by the wind sighing through the decaying structures, and for a moment, they allowed themselves to hope they'd lost him. But as they rounded the corner near an abandoned apartment block, Sarah stumbled, twisting her ankle. She cried out, clutching her leg as pain shot through her, and James and David skidded to a stop. "I'll stay with her," David said quickly, glancing over his shoulder. "You go, James. We'll catch up." James hesitated, but then the haunting memory of Mark's scream filled his mind, urging him forward. He gave a single nod, then sprinted toward the cover of another building, his figure disappearing into the shadows. Sarah and David watched him go, the silence thickening around them. Minutes passed, and they both strained their ears, waiting for any sign of pursuit. But the silence remained unbroken. David gently helped Sarah to her feet, wrapping her arm around his shoulder as they hobbled toward the nearest shelter, a dilapidated, two-story apartment building. The interior was dark, filled with the stale scent of mold and decay. They moved cautiously, their eyes darting to every corner, every shadow, bracing for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a faint shuffling sound came from somewhere below. They froze, their breaths caught in their throats. David signaled for Sarah to stay still as he crept forward, peering down the stairwell. And there, at the bottom of the stairs, was the man in the gas mask. He stood motionless, his glassy eyes fixed on David, his head tilted slightly, as if studying his next victim. David's heart pounded wildly, his mind screaming at him to run, but he couldn't move. The man slowly lifted a gloved hand, pointing straight at him, and then began to ascend the stairs, each step slow, deliberate, and filled with an unsettling purpose. "Run," David hissed, grabbing Sarah's arm and dragging her up the stairs. They stumbled into one of the apartment units, slamming the door shut behind them and pushing a rusted cabinet against it. But the man's footsteps never faltered. They heard him pause outside, then the door handle jiggled, rattling as he tried to force his way inside. Sarah pressed her hand over her mouth, muffling her terrified breaths as she stared at the door, watching as it shuddered beneath the man's weight. A few agonizing seconds passed, and then silence. The handle stilled, the shuffling footsteps receded, and the oppressive quiet settled over them once more. For a brief moment, they dared to hope he had given up, but that hope was shattered by a faint scratching sound against the wall behind them, slowly inching upward. David's stomach twisted as he realized the man was climbing the outside of the building, heading for the window. "Out! Now!" he hissed, grabbing Sarah's hand as they bolted out of the room and into the hallway, barely daring to look back. They heard the window shatter behind them, followed by the man's heavy, rasping breaths filling the room they had just left. They sprinted down the corridor, but with Sarah's injured ankle slowing them down, they knew he would catch up soon. David took a desperate look around, spotting an old, rusted fire escape just a few meters away. "Sarah, climb," he urged, helping her onto the fire escape as quickly as he could. She winced in pain, but scrambled upward, pulling herself onto the narrow ledge. As she climbed higher, David turned to face the corridor. The man in the gas mask emerged from the shadows, his unblinking gaze locked onto David. For a second, they stared at each other, the silence between them thick with unspoken dread. And then the man raised his hand again, pointing directly at David. In a surge of adrenaline, David climbed up after Sarah, the two of them scrambling onto the roof as the man's footsteps grew closer. They could hear him below, methodically following their path, his breathing distorted and heavy beneath the gas mask. Meanwhile, James had run deeper into the heart of Pripyat, losing track of where he was. He was alone now, separated from his friends, surrounded by towering, empty buildings that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The silence pressed in around him, amplifying every tiny sound. The crunch of gravel beneath his feet, the distant creak of metal, the faint whisper of the wind. But no matter where he turned, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every corner held the possibility of those glassy eyes staring back at him. Panic gnawed at him, clouding his thoughts as he struggled to navigate the twisted maze of Pripyat's ruins. He stumbled into an old school building, the air thick with the scent of mold and decay. Dust floated through the stagnant air, catching the faint beams of sunlight filtering through the cracked windows. James moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing down the silent halls. But as he passed by a row of lockers, a strange sound stopped him in his tracks, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from somewhere ahead, growing louder with each step. James's heart pounded as he approached a classroom door, the sound intensifying, filling the air with a pulsing dread. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob, and then slowly pushed it open. Inside, the classroom was empty, the rows of desks covered in layers of dust. But in the far corner, scratched into the chalkboard, was a single word: run. A chill ran down his spine. He backed out of the room, his mind racing, but as he turned, he saw him. The man in the gas mask, standing at the end of the hallway, his glassy eyes staring straight at him. James took a step back, his throat dry with fear. The man tilted his head, as though in contemplation, and then began to walk toward him. His footsteps echoed through the empty school, each one sending a jolt of terror through James's body. With a strangled gasp, James turned and ran, his footsteps pounding against the floor as he bolted through the hallways, desperate to escape. He could hear the man's slow, unhurried steps behind him, relentless and inevitable, closing the distance with every second. The chill of Pripyat's darkened streets seemed to seep into their bones as they fled, each of them haunted by the memory of Mark's final, desperate scream. Every corner felt like a trap, every shadow a hiding place for the man in the gas mask, who now haunted their every thought. Alone, James sprinted through the deserted city, his breaths coming in shallow gasps, the echo of his own footsteps hammering in his ears. The silence was overwhelming. Pripyat wasn't merely abandoned. It was a city shrouded in dread, as though every wall and broken window had absorbed decades of despair, and now, all of it watched him. He reached the skeletal remains of a playground and paused, his gaze drawn to the ghostly Ferris wheel that loomed overhead. The faint creak of metal in the wind was the only sound, but even it felt like a warning. "Think, James, think," he whispered to himself, glancing around for any possible escape route. Just then, he spotted a flicker of movement near the swing set. Heart pounding, he turned slowly, dreading what he would find. But the only thing there was a rusty swing, gently swaying as though touched by invisible hands. He let out a shaky breath, willing himself to believe it was just the wind. But then he heard it, a faint, distorted breathing, coming from somewhere close by. It was unmistakable, the harsh, unnatural rasp that had haunted his nightmares since entering the city. His gaze darted to the shadows, his mind screaming for him to run, but his body refused to move. And then he saw him. The man in the gas mask stood just beyond the broken fence, his head tilted as he watched James with an almost predatory stillness. The glass eyes of the mask glinted in the dim light, revealing nothing but cold, empty darkness behind them. James took a step back, his entire body trembling with fear, but the man raised one gloved hand, pointing directly at him. It was a gesture of warning, or perhaps of inevitability. Without another thought, James turned and bolted, the terror flooding his veins, overpowering any rational thought. He sprinted down the cracked sidewalk, ducking through alleys and leaping over debris, every instinct screaming that he needed to get away, to find Sarah and David before it was too late. Meanwhile, Sarah and David moved cautiously through the narrow corridors of an abandoned apartment building, their eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. They knew he was out there, stalking them, and they dared not make a sound. Sarah's ankle throbbed painfully, but she forced herself to keep moving, clutching David's arm for support. "We need to find James," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the faint rustling of leaves outside. "We can't keep running like this. He'll pick us off one by one." David nodded, though his face was etched with fear. "We just need to stay together, okay? If we find a safe place, we can wait for him. He'll come back for us. He has to." But deep down, they both knew there was no safe place in Pripyat. The entire city felt like a trap, a labyrinth designed to ensnare them, and the man in the gas mask was its relentless warden. They crept through a dusty corridor, moving past doors that hung open like gaping mouths, leading into rooms filled with the relics of forgotten lives. Toys lay scattered on the floors, faded photographs on walls, broken furniture covered in layers of dust. It was as though time had stopped here, leaving behind an eerie stillness that felt almost alive. Suddenly, Sarah froze, her eyes widening as she spotted something on the wall ahead. A series of scratches, gouged deep into the plaster. They formed words, jagged and uneven, as though carved in a frenzy. "He is coming." A chill ran down her spine, and she exchanged a horrified glance with David. "Do you think, could it be Mark? Maybe he tried to warn us," she whispered, her voice barely a tremor. David shook his head, his face pale. "No, it's not Mark's handwriting." They stared at the message, feeling the weight of dread settle over them, pressing down like a physical force. They needed to leave, to get as far away from this cursed place as possible. But as they turned to go, a faint metallic scrape echoed through the hallway. The sound was unmistakable. The man was here, somewhere close, moving with the patience of a predator closing in on its prey. They backed away, glancing frantically for an escape. But the building's layout had become a twisted maze in their minds. Every hallway looked the same. Every door led to a dead end. Panic gripped them as they realized they were trapped, with no way out. "Sarah, this way," David urged, pulling her toward a stairwell that spiraled down into darkness. They had no choice. They had to take their chances. Together, they stumbled down the stairs, each step echoing in the silence, their breaths shallow with fear. But as they reached the bottom, the faint, distorted breathing grew louder, closer. It was no longer coming from behind them. It was coming from the stairwell itself. David turned, his flashlight casting a weak beam that trembled as he shone it upward. And there, halfway up the stairs, was the man in the gas mask, slowly descending toward them, each step deliberate, his eyes fixed unblinkingly on them. "Run," David shouted, shoving Sarah forward as they bolted through the nearest doorway, barely daring to glance back. The building twisted and turned around them, trapping them in a nightmarish labyrinth, but they didn't stop, their only thought to put as much distance between them and the relentless figure behind them. After what felt like hours of fleeing through Pripyat's deserted streets, Sarah and David finally stumbled out into a large square. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, and Sarah's ankle throbbed painfully with every step, but they had no choice but to press on. The silent buildings loomed around them, tall and oppressive, as though watching their every move. Do you think he's gone?" Sarah whispered, clutching David's arm as she cast a wary glance over her shoulder. David shook his head, his face etched with fear and exhaustion. "I don't know, but we can't stop. Not yet." They took a step forward, but a faint sound stopped them in their tracks, a distant engine rumbling through the silence. They froze, exchanging disbelieving looks. Could it be? Were they saved? Out of the fog, a convoy of military vehicles appeared, their headlights piercing through the gloom. Soldiers stepped out, scanning the area, and one of them spotted Sarah and David, raising a hand in greeting. Relief flooded through them as they stumbled forward, shouting for help, waving their arms frantically. The soldiers ushered them into one of the vehicles, their faces etched with concern as they tried to understand what had happened. But as the convoy began to pull away, Sarah felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to look back. She turned, peering out the rear window, her heart pounding in her chest. And there, in the window of a nearby building, she saw him. The man in the gas mask stood perfectly still, his head tilted slightly as he watched the convoy disappear. His glassy eyes seemed to follow them, as though marking them, memorizing their faces. And then, slowly, he raised one hand, waving in a mocking, almost taunting farewell. Days passed after their return, but the terror of Pripyat lingered in their minds like a shadow, haunting their every thought. No matter how hard they tried to forget, the memory of that faceless, relentless figure refused to fade. Sarah and David tried to return to their normal lives, but everything felt different now. Every shadow, every creak in the darkness brought back the fear, the feeling that they were still being watched. Sarah caught herself glancing over her shoulder constantly, half expecting to see him standing there, silently waiting. One night, as she was lying in bed, she heard a faint tapping sound at her window. Her heart raced as she sat up, her hand trembling as she reached for the light. She forced herself to look, to prove to herself that it was nothing. But when she turned, she saw a faint, foggy outline on the glass, as though a gloved hand had pressed against it, leaving a smudged print. And beneath it, scrawled in the condensation, were two chilling words: "Still watching." Her scream echoed into the empty room, but she knew no one would come. The man in the gas mask was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. James, too, was plagued by nightmares, visions of the man's glassy eyes staring back at him from the darkness. In every reflection, every fleeting shadow, he saw that faceless mask, felt the weight of those unblinking eyes. He could feel him, even miles away, a silent presence that would never let him go. Pripyat had not let them escape. It had marked them, bound them to its endless shadows. And somewhere in its decaying ruins, the man in the gas mask waited, ready to hunt again.